Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I am so delighted to be with our guest today, Doug Westerbeke. He is the author of A Short Walk Through a Wide World, which is getting all the praise and all the love. There is a fantastic story behind this book. This story is about some of my favorite topics. It's one of my favorite kinds of book. It's a book similar to the kind of book that I myself have written. So we just have so much to get into, and I can't wait for you guys to get to know Doug a little bit the way I got to know him through this fabulous book. But a few things before we get started. Of course, at The Thoughtful Bro, we are live streaming on A Mighty Blaze on Facebook, YouTube, and X. I think that's the first time I went with X and not Twitter. I'm a slow adopter. But we're on Facebook, YouTube, and X. We're here on most Tuesdays at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. If you don't know about A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and now beyond, 4 years strong at A Mighty Blaze. A quick reminder about today's episode. Right after today's episode, at the top of the hour, A Mighty Blaze's own Trisha Blanchette is going to be on to talk about her third book in her Neath trilogy. It's called Herrick's Key. That's launching today as well. So after my interview with Doug, please stick around at 3 and tune in for Trisha Blanchette. At A Mighty Blaze, we are never asking for money. If you want to show us the love, just follow us and like us on social media. Tell your friends about us. And if you are in the mood to spend money, please spend it on heartrending and magical stories about one woman's adventurous quest to find meaning in her life. Books like A Short Walk Through a Wide World by Doug Westerbeke. We'll put a link to buy the book from bookshop.org in the chat. And if you want to ask Doug a question, please feel free. Just put it in the chat and it will make its way to me. We'll ask him at the end. And now, a little bit more about this week's guest. Doug Westerbeke is a librarian who lives in Cleveland, Ohio. He works at one of the largest libraries in the United States. He spent the last decade on the local panel of the International Dublin Literary Award, which inspired him to write his own book. His debut novel, A Short Walk Through a Wide World, is the tale of one woman's adventurous life, traveling the globe, trying to outrun a mysterious curse that will kill her if she stops moving. The New York Times writes, and this has to be one of my favorite all-time blurbs. It's the blurb that I wish I could have for my book. It's so great. Imagine the life of Pi, the Alchemist, and the Midnight Library rolled into one fantastical fable. Sign me up right there. Doug Westerbeke, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Hey, it's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Oh, we both have then. So Doug, I love the book. I finished it on an airplane yesterday. It was all the things that blurb very generously said it was. I love how you've been describing it as sort of somewhere between Dante's Inferno and Indiana Jones. It's just, and for me, that is like the perfect mixture of kind of like fun adventure and spiritual searching. It's just so my cup of tea. I can't even stand it. But I'm just wondering, does that description land for you?
Oh, totally. So I was listening to some of your podcasts. I listened to your one about it was Jenna Bloom interviewing you about Bunyan. So that's why I'm wearing my lumberjack stuff here. Solidarity, that. But and I was listening. I was like, oh my God! It was like listening to me because you were talking about Gilgamesh. Why can't people talk about Gilgamesh? I love these old epic poems and things like that. There's a lot of Dante in this book, actually, but every time I say that, everybody's like, don't compare it to Dante. Addie LaRue, Life of Pi, Dante's a little old, so you kind of.
So Doug. Yeah, I mean, Doug, we are just completely on the same wavelength here because whenever I bring up Gilgamesh, just as you said, like to my publisher and my marketing person, they're always just like, no, like maybe just leave that part out. But it's like, I love. Sorry, what'd you say?
They frown upon that kind of thing. Yeah.
They do. But yeah, I feel the same way, Doug. I feel like when I hear you talk about your work, I am kind of like the spiritual kind of fable qualities of it. I think this book just has so much that I admire in writing, and clearly it's reflected in my own work, which I think is just very similar in its spirit and its tone to your work. But here I am. I've talked a lot about your book. Why don't you just tell our audience, for those who may not know, what is the book about?
All right. Yeah, I'll give you my elevator pitch. So it's a little girl. She's 9 years old. She's in 1880s Paris, Aubrey Torvel. And she's eating dinner with her parents or their family at the dinner table. And all of a sudden she gets really sick. And her parents freak out. They don't know what to do. So they get her in the coach. They take her to the doctor, and then she's fine. But when she comes back home again, all of a sudden she's sick all over again. And this is a nasty sickness. It's like there's bleeding and there's horrible pain and her spine is twisting, all that. They rush her back to the hospital and she's even worse. And they're doing whatever they can, what they can think of, but nothing works. So she, in her desperation, she just escapes, runs out the door, down the hallway, into the streets of Paris at night, places she's never been before. And she's fine. And she realizes it's this act of exploration of being somewhere she's never been that cures her. So she spends the rest of her life wandering around and around the world, constantly on the run from this disease. That's the one I give everybody.
It's amazing what a concept. It's one of my favorite kind of high concepts for a book that I've seen in a while. I mean, to me, it didn't just, I mean, Life of Pi, The Alchemist, Midnight Library, I understand all those comps. A couple other things it made me think of was this book, Sophie's World, from many years ago. Yes, I love that book too. I mean, that book's maybe 30 years old at this point or something, but I remember reading it kind of as a young man, and it also featured a young woman, but it's also about kind of her learning about philosophy and spirituality. And so I think the tone and maybe the main character was slightly similar. But another thing is that it reminded me of the Odyssey, because
there's another comp I can't use.
But you can with me. This is a safe space, Doug. So the reason why it reminded me of the Odyssey is the structure of the story, which is that, you have a front story where she is like going through an actual adventure in the present and advancing the adventure, but she's meeting with different people in the front story. And then she ends up telling the backstory to them. And that's very similar to, Odysseus. He's like trying to get home. And so there's a front story, and then he ends up on different islands, and they're like, well, where have you been? How did you get here? And he's like, well, let me tell you that story. And then for a few chapters, you go back and hear about a different episode of his life. So I thought the structure of the book was terrific and classic and really interesting.
It was tricky. So in the original outline, because I always start with like a 1-page outline, and I just do like, the most important scenes, and then I expand it from there. And I remember my original outline was even crazier. I mean, it was like stories within stories within stories until you lost track of like who she was telling the story to in the first place. And it was really fun to write. I love writing stuff like that, but it was kind of confusing to pull off. So I actually ended up simplifying it, so people found it easier to track her journey and all that kind of thing. But yeah, it was even crazier at one point.
Oh my gosh. Well, it didn't seem crazy to me. It seemed very in control, for what it's worth. So I think your editor, you did a great job when you were editing it. Let's talk about her condition, which is, it's just very simple and so kind of poetic. This condition where she just has to keep moving. And if she doesn't keep moving, she'll die. This kind of cursed with this nomadic, mandate, if you will. I'm just wondering why that feels like such a great kind of metaphor for the human condition. Like, why do you think that just works so well? Was it, for example, merely a plot device that you thought was interesting and allowed you to write this great world traveling adventure story? Or is there something essential there about human life?
Well, the story started off, for me, it was actually a short story in which it was like an old lady, and she just had some minor ailment. It was like arthritis and something. So she goes to her doctor, and again, in 1880s, and she goes to her doctor, and the doctor says, well, you should just go somewhere warm and dry, and all she hears is travel. And so she takes his advice way too seriously. You got this crazy old lady traveling around North Africa and the islands and all around the world, right? And so it was kind of a comedy when I first thought of it. And it was like a joke, the cure being worse than the actual sickness. And but the more I thought about it, it just kept snowballing. So I was like, oh, I could do this. I could have her discover something about the world. I could have her get into an adventure there. And it just got so big, I realized I could not fit it all in the life of an old lady. So it just changed. It became a young girl. And if she's going to become a young girl, a 9-year-old girl, whatever it is, because now I've got the whole life to play with. And if I'm going to kick her out of home for her whole life, it's got to be something serious. It can't be a tummy ache, it's got to be something really terrifying. Otherwise she'll just like grin and bear it, but yeah, so to me, like almost every story I know, even the ones that all take place in a single setting, they're all about somebody who's been like, they're living a nice, comfortable existence, right? And then all of a sudden, everything goes wrong all at once. And now they're thrown out of their comfortable existence. They're living in the chaos of the world, and they have to adjust to that somehow. And you either adjust to the chaos so you can get back home again, or you just plain simply adjust to the chaos and live a whole new kind of life. So I guess that's where I was coming from when it came up with a sickness. It had to be something serious. It had to kick her out of her existence.
Yeah, but just to dig deeper, because I really want to get underneath this, why do you think it resonates? I mean, when you talk about this book, you talk about it as a person searching for meaning. And indeed, the characters talk about this. And we'll get in a little bit later into some of the specific things the characters say about a search for meaning. But like, why is it that this condition seems a kind of profound metaphor for the kind of wandering nature of the human spirit and the human condition?
Right. Oh, okay. So I see what you're saying. So I'm thinking of the mechanics of it. But yeah, so if you're going deeper now you had to picture a little girl kicked out of her home at a very young age. She's like 9 when she gets sick. She's 11 when she just leaves her mom. And now she's literally, for the rest of her life, she's on her own. And yeah, so you just start thinking about it and you're like, well, what must that be like? And you've got no family anymore. You've got no friends that you can keep because you have to constantly keep moving. You've got no place you can really call home anymore because it's the nice way of saying is that you're a citizen of the world, but even that's not quite accurate because you're not a citizen of anywhere really. And so it feels like a permanent exile, and she's got to sit there and figure out, well, how do I find a meaning in a life that feels like a lifelong punishment? Like, why is this me? There's going to be that whole kind of, why have I been singled out for this? Why does everybody else get to live a great life and I don't? And so there's that. You've got to be able to find a meaning to your life somehow through all that mess. And that's a lot of what the book explores right there.
And she does go to all these fantastic places all around the world. It's really a travelogue kind of book in a way, as she just keeps moving and moving and goes around and literally around and around the world over and over again. Are you a big traveler? You have the travel bug yourself?
I love travel. Travel's fun. But so I've been a lot of places. Like even since I was a little kid, like my dad built his own boat. And we would sail, and it was big enough to fit the whole family on. And we would sail up and down the coast of Maine. We would sail down to Cape Cod. I remember in high school, I used to take road trips with my girlfriend just to see what was around. I grew up in Boston. So we would just drive down to Hartford just because we'd never been and we wanted to see it and things like that. When I went to school, I went as far away as I could just because, not that I had nothing wrong with my family, loved my family, loved Boston, all that, but I wanted to see the rest of the world as well. So I just, out in LA for a while. I was up in Canada for a while. But you can overdo it. So this is the thing. My dad used to say, oh man, I am sick of travel. I just don't, because he used to have to travel for his work. And then after a certain age, he's like, I never want to go anywhere again. I want to sit down, listen to my music and be done. My wife travels a lot. She plays violin in an orchestra. So they tour all over the place. And she travels all the time when she's just saying, I just want to be home with my kids. So I get that it can be overdone. I remember going to China with my 2 kids, and we started in the south. We spent 3 or 4 weeks going up north, and we took our time and we saw so many things day in, day out. By the time we got to Beijing, we're done. We're not going anywhere. We slept for like 3 days. There was no Great Wall. There was no Forbidden Palace. We went out to eat. We came home and we slept and that was that, I can totally understand how it's overdone. So imagine like poor Aubrey, she's got, you reading the book, you've got one foot in the whole adventure of it, which is exciting for all us who are reading it. But if you're her, you've got this one foot in this like this constant migration, and it just never stops. And yeah, it can totally wear you out, but she just adjusts to it, and she has to live that way.
She's an amazing character, and I just love her, and I love her for all that she goes through, and for this curse that is upon her, and how she tries to make meaning out of her life and tries to establish relationships with people to the extent that she can. I'm curious, what would you say that you love most about Aubrey, the character?
What I love most about her, she's feisty, and all right, I'm going to tell you this story, and you'll think less of me if I tell you. But I'm going to tell you the story about how I became an avowed atheist when I was 7, because this has everything to do with the answer to that question. So when I was like a little kid, I got into a fight with my little brother, because I can't remember what it was about. I think I wanted to watch Godzilla, and he wanted to watch 60 Minutes because he was like the brainiac in the family, and he wins. And so I went out in the backyard to sulk about it. And I remember getting under a maple tree and praying and saying, God, if you can hear me, just exact the worst, horrible punishment on my little brother you can think of. Just exact holy vengeance on this kid. And so I waited like days and weeks later, and nothing happened to my little brother. He was fine. And I was like, that's it, we're through, and I stuck to this because I was such an idiot. I stuck to this concept like into my adulthood. My arguments got a little more sophisticated, but basically that was the impetus of the whole thing. But then the most amazing thing started happening was I noticed through my writing, I was writing all these characters who are either atheistic or didn't particularly like God, but they were beloved by God anyway. And I was like, wow, this keeps happening in my stories over and over again. Where is this coming from? So I'm not particularly religious. I'm not Christian. I'm not Buddhist, but I don't go around calling myself an atheist anymore, because through my writing, I'm starting to realize there's more to it than that. And so it led me into this whole investigation of the great religious texts. I loved reading the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Bhagavad Gita. I always say that wrong. The Bhagavad Gita. I always say Vita instead of Gita. Anyway, the Mahabharata, the Shinto, all the Shinto myths and all those stories. And I loved them. And they're the best stories on earth. As a writer, there was just a treasure trove, right? Because you've got like these stories that are really dramatic, and they're really profound, and they've been refined. Like they're over 1,000 years old. They're like perfectly chiseled stories. And there's like just a mine of them out there. And it totally fascinated me. And I love stories of enlightenment that you got from the Eastern religions, Taoism, almost all the religions have it, but particularly Taoism and Hinduism and Buddhism are big on the enlightenment thing. So I got a lot of this story comes from there. But I also love these Old Testament stories where, you're just some poor slob living in the desert, and all of a sudden God comes down and says, you know what? I don't know, Jonah, I want you to go down to Nineveh and convert everybody to Christianity. And Jonah's like, what? I would not. You know what? You go ahead. I'll catch up. And he does, to his credit, Jonah does everything he can to get out of this mission. And I love that about him, because it's insane. I mean, he's butting heads with the most powerful, most incomprehensible force in the universe. He has no chance of winning this fight, but he fights it anyway. And so I really admire him. Life would have been so much easier for him if he just did what God said, because God wasn't out there to punish him. He was actually giving him like a meaning to his life, a purpose, like go out and do this and you're going to be good. And Jonah fights it anyway for the longest time. And there's something about that I really admire. And Aubrey in this book is a lot the same way. She's up against, she's butting heads with forces that are way bigger than she is. And this is a story of enlightenment, and she didn't get there, but she really doesn't want it. But she's going to get there whether she does or whether she wants it or not. That's not the issue. The issue, this is a pretty epic story. And to me, the most epic part is the fact that she's butting heads with, she's fighting a fight she can't possibly win. And until she gets her head around what her mission really is, she's making her life miserable for herself. And that's where the whole meaning comes in. And that's where that's my favorite part of her character, really, is the fact that it's stupid, but it's admirable at the same time. You know what I mean? There's this kind
Oh
of
yeah. Well, Doug, I mean, a few other pieces of literature that come to mind when you're talking about this is one, the Book of Job, which is like,
yeah,
that's like an argument. It's like more about an argument. There's not like a big quest, but Job is just like, I don't understand what I'm being punished for, and arguing with, the most powerful being. And Job gets an answer to his questions, which is, one of the most kind of moving and stunning pieces of literature that we have. And, another work of literature that pops to mind as you're talking is Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett, in the sense that like it's a play in some ways about an expected meaning and a search for meaning. Like one day meaning will come, like one day Godot will show up, and then our lives will make sense. But it's actually about, really what it's about is, while you're waiting for a meaning that sort of never arrives in the way that you wish it would, look what you have. You have these friendships and these relationships along the way. And that's sort of what kind of, I think, how Beckett saw human existence. And as you're talking now, I'm like, that sort of reminds me of the view in your book as well.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of Waiting for Godot. Now I want to watch it again.
Yeah. Anyway, it's so funny because I know your publicist is going to get mad about this, because I keep talking about all these great works of literature and then comparing them to your thing, and I know that like that might seem scary to some readers. And the great thing about your book, which I love so much, is just how accessible it is. So I wrote a piece recently for Cognoscenti, WBR's kind of culture magazine, and it's about the importance and the endurance of the adult fairy tale as a genre. And I feel like my book, Bunyan and Henry, is in this category of kind of trying to meditate on big questions about life and how you should live your life. And there's a kind of feeling of childhood awe and wonder, and there's adventure in these kinds of stories. And other authors that I think are in this category, I based part of the essay on an essay by J.R. Tolkien about the fairy tale and about how he felt like he was writing in a fairy tale tradition. I think people like Mitch Albom, I think people like Shelby Van Pelt are writing in this. And if I could have that article back and rewrite it, I definitely would have included this book, but I wrote it a couple months ago, so I wasn't aware of your book at the time. But I'm just wondering, for me to say that your book fits into adult fairy tale, feel free to say that that's not quite how you see it, but I'm just curious.
No, I think that works. I've been calling it magical realism because I really don't know what else to call it. And I love magical realism. But my editor actually said, it's not actually magical realism. I was like, it's not. And I was so blown away. I didn't even think to ask her, well, what the hell is it? but I'm thinking about it. And if you go back, I mean, before magical realism, they called it what? Surrealism, like Kafka.
Mm-hmm.
I think they called that surrealism, right? And then before that, it's something else. And before that, it was epic poems like the Odyssey and Gilgamesh. Because what is that stuff? It's not real. It's not realism, right? Otherwise, they'd be talking about some tile maker somewhere putting a floor together. It's not what they're talking about. So fairy tales makes total sense to me. I think there's a long history of this stuff. It may be the oldest history of literature there is out there. And I think the name just keeps changing. And I think it adjusts and it does different things with itself. And so people feel compelled to give it a new name. But I think it's all there. So adult fairy tales totally make sense to me. Actually, I kind of like that.
Yeah. Did you have a certain age of audience in mind? I mean, I think like this is a kind of book that a precocious 12-year-old could read. And I think this is a book that a 90-year-old could read. I think this is really an all ages kind of modern day fable. But did you kind of have a kind of reader in mind?
Not especially. I mean, I write for me mostly. I think most writers do. Most writers, they're not trying to second guess their audience. That's like a fool's errand, right? You can never do it. You write what you want to write, what feels good to you. But I've always, at the same time, I always imagined it would be for a broad audience. And yeah, I could totally picture my kids who are like, 15, 16, they could totally read this. And yeah, even younger, I would think.
Yeah, totally. All right. So we got about 15 minutes left, and we have some questions from the audience. We'll get to those in a minute. But I want to go through a few quotes in the book, Doug, that I really, really liked and that I think are worth unpacking. And I just kind of want to hear you talk about what you meant by some of these great quotes. So the first one is, the best way to survive some things is to not understand them. Tell me about that.
That's a tough one. I'm going to have to pick myself up. I just remembered my computer's not plugged in and the battery's about to die. So you're going to get a tour of my house while I'm answering this.
Okay.
So
this is great. How the writer lives.
Yeah, this is my cave down here where I hide away from everybody. And, all right. So what was the quote was? Tell me the quote again.
I'm going to give you the quote again. Hold on. You still there, Doug? I lost you for a second.
Oh, you're still
there?
No,
I think. Yeah, I got you. I got you. You just wigged out for a second. But here we go. So the quote is, the best way to survive some things is to not understand them.
Yeah. So that really is expressing a lot of what Aubrey's personality is like. She doesn't count the days. She doesn't keep track of where she's gone. She calls herself, she's not a statistician. She's a walker. So, here I am. Now I'm in my bedroom. All right. So she doesn't call herself a statistician. She's a walker. She almost, in a way, she's kind of accepting who she is and what she's doing. And the reasons, kind of like Job, actually, the reasons for what happened to her are so difficult to comprehend. There's almost no point in trying. And I think that's where she's coming from. And Aubrey isn't a great deep thinker or anything like that. She's an action-oriented kind of person, like my daughter, by the way. So she'll just go out and she'll just do something, as opposed to sit down there and mull it over and, like this all day long. She's just not that kind of character. So that was really, when I wrote that line, I was thinking of her character more than anything else, I think. And I think there's a lot of people who are like that. When events get so overwhelming, you kind of just shut down and you just kind of let the events take you somewhere instead. That's been my experience with people anyway.
Absolutely. And yeah, to me, that spoke a lot to the way people deal with trauma, sort of as you were just saying, right? I mean, at some point, you just can't think about it anymore and you just have to move on just to survive. So I thought that was a very powerful quote. Let's do two more of these. And the second one is, there are things in the world that only exist because you beheld them. If you weren't there, they never would have been. Talk about that.
Yeah. So this is a book, really, it's about witnessing the wonders of the world. If you make yourself available to them, they'll show up. She goes off on this. So I had someone ask me about colonialism. I remember, because there's a section of the book that takes place in India under British rule. And I wasn't ready for an answer at all. But what I remember saying was that I thought it was very nuanced and I wasn't trying to go for a particular thing. Really, what I should have said is that all the history is nuanced, and it really is. There's so much happening in history that it's almost impossible to paint in these broad brushstrokes. And so to give you an example of where I'm going, like Schindler's List is, it's a gut-wrenching story about the Holocaust, but what they did, and one of the reasons why it's one of the great movies ever made, is that part of the reason anyway, is because they found a story about a card-carrying Nazi who saved the lives of all these Jews, hundreds of them. It's an amazing story. So when Aubrey goes to colonial India, I didn't want to write a story about the ravages of colonialism because we all know that, and it's been done. I want to write a story about the wonders of the world. So I write this sequence where, and it's fleeting, but it's where the British and the Indians and the royalty and the servants, they all come together for a moment to protect Aubrey. So in the course of this book, it's a smaller wonder, but it's a wonder all the same. And that's what I'm really trying to do in this story. I think if you make yourself available, if you're going to be like Aubrey and you're going to wander the world, you're going to see stuff that you wouldn't see otherwise. And you're going to experience things like that you may not experience otherwise. And your attitude is also, if you've got the right attitude, these wonders are going to come to you.
Mm. And the final quote that I have is sort of similar to the vein that you were just heading down, but here it is. If you can't make your life meaningful, make it extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, because actually, in a way, I mean, well, no, you don't have to be extraordinary. So you can make your life meaningful just by being a really great parent or a really good friend to somebody. And that's not necessarily extraordinary. It's really decent. And it's something to be admired. If you're not in the position to do that, let's say you go somewhere else and make your life big and just do things that others just can't get around to doing. And yeah, I get that line thrown at me a lot. And I really ought to put a little more thought into it. But I'm not sure, you know what they say. She says it's a stupid thing. I remember. So the voice is she has this voice in her head, and the voice in her head keeps telling her these things. And the voice in her head is, well, if you can't make it meaningful, make it extraordinary. The voice is pushing her out of the world. It's pushing her off into all this, into the chaos of the world. It's not necessarily where you find meaning, but you can. So if you get off your butt and you go out and you see the world, you're going to make it a lot easier to find that meaning. So just by living an extraordinary life, it might actually be easier to find the meaning in it. I think that's where I was going with that line.
Well, I think when you kind of sum it all up, it does go back to, you know, your own kind of, started from a very early age, your own kind of dialogue with God or the universe or with life itself. Kind of, what does my life mean? And it is really a struggle. It's not something that has an easy answer. And it's something which, you know, if I can judge from the book that I just read, and certainly the ending of the book, I think that it's something that is this. There's that old Bible story. Oh God, I forget who is wrestling with the angel, but about the story about what Jacob, right? Wrestling with the angel all night. I mean, I feel like this is you wrestling with the angel, and it's like, and who wins that? And is that even winnable? But this is sort of, it feels like this is the big question for you, or one of the big questions in your own life that you truly are wrestling with in these pages. And I wanted to take that notion and leap to a kind of craft question. It's a very interesting thing about the ending of the book. And without giving anything away about the ending of the book, I think it's safe to say that, you know, you have wondered at times about the ending of the book. And so I don't want to give anything more away, but I just want to put it over to you and ask you about the ending of the book. You know, and if you don't want to risk spoiling anything, at the very least, you could come at it from a kind of craft perspective, because I know a lot of writers listen to this show and a lot of people have difficulty ending their book. And I think it's very interesting that you have some mixed feelings about how you chose to end it, even, and that too is something that you struggled with a long time.
Yeah. So, and this book was kind of unique for me, is because when I actually sat down to write it, I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to end it. Normally, I wouldn't even start a book unless I know exactly how it's going to end. This one, I decided it was a little more improvisatory. Is that the right word? I don't know. So I was not quite making it all. I had an idea how I was going to end it, but I knew it was going to be tricky to land, and it was tricky to land. And me and my agent and my editor, we discussed this and fought over the ending for a long time, trying to get it just right. And I remember I wanted to keep it I wanted to have a very poetic ending. I was very moved at the time by movies, and I still am, by movies like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, which I thought was a beautiful ending. And I don't know to this day what the hell it means, but it was so profound when the scene of the bridge at the end. No idea why she does that, but it kills me every time I watch it. And I was going for that kind of a poetry to the end of this book as well. And it's difficult to land on that kind of a note. And you want to satisfy the audience, and you want to, you know, kind of wrap up as much as you can, but at the same time, wrapping up isn't necessarily the most poetic way to do it. So it was tricky. It's a mystery in both senses of the word. There's like, okay, what's going on here? There's the mystery of the book that way. And there's also, in the old-fashioned medieval sense, the mystery of how the world works, and how much of it, like Job, how much of it we don't understand. And that's what they used to call mysteries way back when. So there's both of those going on. So for the contemporary idea of a mystery, like what is going on in Aubrey's trails here, I drop lots, to my credit, I drop lots of clues. They're all throughout the novel, but I don't have a little parlor room scene at the end where it's all explained. So it's tricky. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, well, we don't want to necessarily do that. We want it to have this kind of resonance without explaining everything, because explaining everything, it's kind of like explaining a joke. It kind of ruins the joke, right? You don't want to do that. So it was tough to land, and we kept going back and forth, and I'm not entirely sure I managed it yet either. So it's, but I mean, I do love the poetry. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it other than that. I think yeah, we were going for the poetry. It was tough to end it. It was tough to land it, I should say.
Well, I think, you had recalled in another interview where you had read an outline of the story to your wife, and she had said the ending is like music. And I think that is quite appropriate. And just as music transcends verbal expression and transcends kind of an easy meaning, I think the ending of your book is just in that way. And frankly, I feel like had the ending been more, crisp and definitive, I don't know if it quite would have fit with the wrestle with the angel, as it were, that is going on through the whole book.
Yeah, well, you don't have a clean answer to a lot of the stories that we like Gilgamesh or whatever. And I shouldn't be referencing all these ancient epic poems all the time, because there's plenty of stuff in the modern age. A Life of Pi can be interpreted two totally different ways. I've interpreted it one way, my best friend interprets it a whole nother way, and that's what makes this kind of stuff really fun and interesting to me as well. So yeah, and you're right that. When I first read the book to my wife, and she, being a musician, she said like that was music, and I was like, yes, that was kind of the exact reaction I wanted from somebody to read the book. I wanted them to see the poetry and the beauty that is in Aubrey's life at the end, because theoretically, if you can see it in her life, you can see it in your own too.
Yep. Well, the ending worked for me, so there's one vote in favor of the ending. A few other questions before we get to some audience questions. You're a person sort of in the middle of your career. Again, I see sort of myself in you. I don't know exactly how old you are, but I feel like we're kind of roughly around the same age, and we both have young kids. Tell me about like your journey to becoming a published author. I mean, the way I think about it is I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I was sort of going as fast as I could, but I just wasn't going to be the guy who got a book out and published when I was 24 years old. It just took a while for the style and the story within me to mature. And I'm just wondering how that is for you, and kind of how you see where you published kind of in the course of your life.
Yeah. So I guess my journey was a little different. I went to, I actually started off as a screenwriter in LA for a long time. And I'd been optioned a bunch of times, but for whatever reasons, none of them got off the ground. None of them were ever produced. And that got really depressing after a while. So I kind of stopped for a while, stopped to raise my kids and all that, but I couldn't quit writing. I remember trying to quit writing at one point, and literally like within hours, I had a whole story pop into my head, beginning to end, the whole dang thing. And it was a really good story. I'm going to write it up someday. But, and I was, damn it, I can't even like do it for a day, And so I just kept at it. And I got, mom used to say, look, you should be like a real writer. You should try writing a novel. No, she didn't say real writer. She said, you should try writing a novel one day. And I'm like, no, I'm the one who said that. I'm like, no, those are what real writers do. I can't do that, because I looked at novels like, oh my God, these are like tremendous works of art. You have to be like a genius to write one of these. And I'm no genius. But then I got on the Dublin Literary Committee through the advice of my boss, Amy Dawson. She said, oh yeah, I think this would be great for you. So I did this. And when you're on the literary committee, for those of you, for people who don't know, it is a literary contest which libraries pick the winners. I guess they go around, they read a bunch of books, and they pick their 3 favorites, and they all send them off to Dublin to the headquarters, and then in Dublin they whittle it down from there, and they pick their favorites, and so on and so forth. But as a member of the committee, I'm reading 50, 100 books a year. And at first you're like agog, these are all great books, blah, blah, blah. But then after a while, you start becoming a little more critical, and because you have to pick the best, and you have to discard the ones that you aren't to your standard or liking, or whatever. And it kind of demystified the process for me. And I started like, well, geez, maybe I could write prose a little bit like this, or maybe I could do that. And that was my journey. So then I wrote a novel inspired by that. And I had to send it off to contests in Britain. This is how I got all my attention when I was a screenwriter, is that I was submitted to contests, and my screenplays would do really well in contests, and I would get a lot of attention. That's how I got the options. So I was like, okay, are there contests for novels? I didn't think there was. I mean, who has time to read a freaking novel? It's crazy. But I found a bunch. They're all in Britain. I couldn't send almost any in America because I'm an older white guy. There's just no contest for me. They don't have them anymore. But in Britain, they don't care. You can be anyone you want. As long as you're writing in English, they're good. So I sent it off to Britain, and I did well in one of them. I got my agent, and from there, it just kind of took off. Like, after, 30 years of trying, all of a sudden it took off, you know?
That's amazing. I think it's crazy. I've done a lot of research on you, but I'd never heard that screenwriter background story. And that actually explains a lot to me, just in terms of the pace and the clarity of the storytelling, which is something I really admire in books. And the idea that like you had some of that Hollywood training or experience, it makes a lot of sense to me, because there are definitely big problems with the way Hollywood tells stories, but they generally are pretty good at keeping the story moving, making sure there's lots of action, and making sure that you understand. And those are all things that I love in literature. So that was really interesting.
I get a lot of the comments like, this is very cinematic and stuff like that. Well, I guess it's my training. I think visually, and I think kinetically, I guess you'd say. Like, there has to be action in every little scene and stuff like that. Love writing dialogue. Mm-hmm. It all came together. So writing prose has really been like the big hurdle for me. So,
well, a major part of writing a book is the prose, but I thought as evidenced by the quotes that I read, which the audience was also loving, I think you did great on the prose side. So one more quick question from me before we go into audience questions for a minute is, you are a librarian, you're reading all these books for this Dublin Award. You're in a library all day long where you're surrounded by just literally almost countless books. I mean, when I go into a library, I just feel so like, stress is not the right word, but it's like walking into like this buffet, this like 5-star buffet, and I wish I could eat it all. And it's sort of almost frustrating and overwhelming, because, even books that are terrible have something that I love in them. I always find something to love, right? And like, much less the books that are like pretty good or the books that are very good. And there's so many books that are very good. And I just feel like I just wish somehow I had like 10 lifetimes to read them all. So anyway, I'm sure you feel like that all the time. But my real question to you as a librarian is just, now you're on the other side. Now your book has a spot on those shelves. And I'm just wondering like how that feels for you. Is it strange to be on the other side?
No, it's hard to say, because in the one sense, it's been surreal. It's just been like this crazy fever dream ride, I mean, like, I can't believe it, because, you've been going for a goal for 30 years, and then all of a sudden it happens. And then all of a sudden you don't even know how to handle it right. And it's strange. But on the flip side, nothing's changed. I mean, I'm still driving my kids to school. I'm still cooking dinner for them. I'm still trying to make sure my cats don't poo all over the house. I mean, nothing else changes. So, I mean, my life is pretty banal, and it's still pretty ordinary. It's still pretty ordinary in that way. And then, but the best part is that I just get to write all the time now. That's what's awesome. And that's the real reward of it, I think.
All right. So, Doug, let's just take a few audience questions here. This is from Robin. Okay, question for Mark and Doug. Have you walked a labyrinth? And if so, what did you find? And I think Robin asked this question sort of when we were discussing more kind of meaning of life type things and how it's hard to kind of discern the meaning of life. And she brought up the image of a labyrinth in the comments. But I'm going to kick this one over to you, Doug, because I have not walked a labyrinth. But have you, and kind of what did it mean to you? And is this book sort of a labyrinth in a way?
A labyrinth. That's it's such an open metaphor. You can really apply it to a lot of different things. I'm thinking. I mean, just like you were asking that, the journey to get this book published, and that was a labyrinth. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I mean, who does, right? It's tough, and you just try whatever you can do, and you're taking wrong turns all the time. So there's that aspect of it. In terms of my book, have you walked a labyrinth? Of this specific book, it feels like a labyrinth, doesn't it? Because she's going from this part of the world to that part of the world. She takes shortcuts. She does this and that. It's a crazy wild ride. And it very much feels like a labyrinth. And actually, quite literally in the book, there is one, I suppose, which I won't give away, but it's there. Past that, I don't know. So I think in terms of like the meaning of life, I'm thinking what Aubrey found and what I have found and what a lot of really smarter people than me have found is that internal voice in your head that so many of us have, that really determines that's going to determine your life, because that voice in your head is what tells the story of your life to yourself. You're figuring out the story of your life by having this lifelong discussion with yourself, right? And if you tell that story wrong, you have done tremendous damage to yourself. And so you've got to be really smart about it. You've got to be realistic. You've got to be able to detach yourself a little from yourself, because, even if you're in the worst possible situation, if you're going through the most horrible time ever, you've got to be able to step back and understand that there's always something in your life that made it worth it. If you don't have that, what do you have? And it's always there. I don't know anybody who doesn't have it. Everybody has made somebody happy at some point. Everybody has somebody they love or something they love. And there's always something. And if you can't find that, you're lost. You have to be able to get that story straight. Best I can do.
What a beautiful answer. I love this idea that, the story you tell yourself is just so essential to, the meaning of your life and, your own mental well-being, really.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, that's what, but that's what we were saying about Aubrey. Aubrey doesn't tell herself the right story until close to the end of I shouldn't give anything away, but that's the struggle of the book. She's not telling herself the right story. Uzair is a character in the book, doesn't tell himself the right story. There are other characters and examples too. Marta directly asks her the question, do you want to be the villain in your own story? Do you want to be a side character? I mean, you've got to tell this story correctly.
I love that. I love it, Doug. All right. Last question here. This is from Renee. Was it difficult to write from a woman's perspective?
No, I get surprised sometimes by how little I get asked this question, but every once in a while somebody will ask it. And it wasn't difficult. And I wrote it, Aubrey, I guess I'll put it this way. I was once asked, like, who are the hardest characters to write and who are the easier characters? The hardest characters to write were the ones who were in the story for a short period of time. Like Uzair is a very complex character, but I only got 50 pages to make that work, right? And same with the Prince and Marta and all the rest of them. But with Aubrey, I had her whole lifetime, and she's the main character, so I had the whole book to write, and I could start off 9 years old and end her when she's whatever she is at the end. And so when I'm writing her as a little girl, it wasn't that hard at all, because she's a spoiled little brat in the beginning, and I was a spoiled little brat when I was a kid. I totally remember this, so I could write that. And then when she was older, she was more of a sullen teen. I wouldn't call myself a sullen teen, but I had my moments, so I could write that. When she was older, I remembered my mom, middle-aged, very fun, everybody loved my mom. She was great. And so she was like just that kind of character. And my grandmother, when she was older, was very timid. She got really scared. I think she kind of became a hermit, just the way Aubrey kind of becomes a hermit in her old age. It was all there. I wasn't thinking any of this stuff while I was writing it. I actually wrote her just came out. It was very intuitive. But later, after the book was done and completed, I started noticing, oh yeah, that's me when I was little. Oh, that's my mom. I remember this really reminds me of mom, especially the way she interacts with children. Totally my mom there. And I remember I recognized my grandmother. I've recognized friends and some of the stuff that happens to her. So it's not that hard, with way more similarities between men and women than there are differences. And there are differences. I'm not shorting those, but way more similarities between us and everybody out there.
Agreed. All right, Doug. So we're going to wrap here. Folks, the book is called A Short Walk Through a Wide World. It's already a national bestseller. And before I let Doug go, I have to ask him the question I ask everybody who comes on the show, which is, and it sounds like you've been listening to my podcast, Doug, so you may already be prepared for this. But imagine that you have an ideal reader for this novel, and imagine that they've just come to the end, they've closed the book, it's sitting on their lap, and describe for me in a word, a phrase, what is the feeling that this reader has?
I would have to defer back to what my wife said, but I'm going to come up with a different word for you. But that my wife's reaction when I first, and I didn't read her the whole book, I just read her an outline of it, and she was like, "That was like music," and it's exactly what I want people to notice, to appreciate the beauty in the poetry that was in Aubrey's life, because that's what I was going for, and if you can feel it, hopefully it's going to be like a really beautiful moment for you when you get to that book, when you get to the end. That's what I was going for anyway.
Well, I felt it, and I didn't just feel it at the end, Doug. I felt it all the way along. This book brought me right in, and it didn't let me go. So, Doug, congratulations on the book. Folks, the link to buy A Short Walk Through a Wide World is in the chat. Please do yourself a favor and buy the book if you haven't already. Doug, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for coming on Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you for having me. That was a blast.
Awesome. And so, folks, we'll be back next week. I'm going to have Caroline Levitt on the show. Mighty Blaze founder Caroline Levitt has a new book out. And right at the top of the hour, just 7 minutes from now, we're going to have T.M. Blanchett on talking about the release of the final book in her trilogy. So stick around for that. And we'll see you soon on Thoughtful Bro. Doug, thanks again.
Thank you.